In the middle of the Indian Ocean sits Tromelin Island, a windswept and barren strip of sand. In 1761, a French ship wrecked here, stranding its crew alongside 150 captives. At the first chance, the crew abandoned them, leaving the captives with no food, no water, and no shelter. What followed was a desperate struggle to survive with absolutely nothing. This is truly a terrifying story, and I don't think you're going to want to miss out. In 1761, the French ship, the Utile, sailed from Madagascar, its hold crammed with nearly 150 Malagasy captives, who all were locked in darkness below deck. Up top, the ship was manned by about 140 French sailors, all assigned to watch the captives. The Malagasy people came from the large island of Madagascar. By the 18th century, they had become the target of the French slave trade. Captives were seized in raids or sold through local networks under pressure from European demand. By this time, though, the French crown had actually banned the transport of the enslaved Malagasy. The trade was officially illegal, but unfortunately, profit spoke louder than law. Wealthy people clamored for cheap labor, and captains, unfortunately, were willing to risk smuggling runs across the treacherous waters to supply this demand. On the Utile, the captain, Jean de la Fargue, was aging, unwell, and deeply uneasy about his mission, but he was driven by money. His first officer, Barthélemy Castellan Duvernay, was a young and ambitious man, and to save time, they would steer a course that ignored official charts, a reckless decision born of haste and a desire for profit. In the dead of the night, their gamble proved fatal. The Utile struck a reef with devastating force. The hull splintered, the mast crashed down, and seawater poured into the hold where the captives were chained. In the darkness, panic erupted. Dozens drowned in the ocean, while others were trapped behind locked hatches and simply perished right where they laid. Above deck, sailors clung to the wreckage as waves battered the ship against the reef. By dawn, what remained of the survivors washed ashore. Around 120 crew and 60 Malagasy captives. In total, around 80 people died in the initial wreck, most of them captives. Ahead of them stretched Tromelin Island itself, a barren scrap of coral and sand, no larger than a small village. It offered no trees, no fresh water, and no shelter. Now, when I say this is a small island, I mean it's small. You could literally walk across it in less than 15 minutes. And here are the survivors on the island, not knowing if they were the lucky ones. Among the survivors was the captain himself. He was already old and unwell, and unfortunately, within days, his strength gave out, and he died right there on that island. His death left the survivors in the hands of his first officer, Barthélemy Duvernay. But despite the captain's death, no one was really concerned, because the harshest realization of all was that Tromelin Island itself offered nothing for them. Because there was no trees, there was no place for the people to get shade from the burning hot sun. Because there was no rivers or pools of fresh water, the survivors that were there quickly became dehydrated. First, survival meant salvaging whatever they could from the wreck. Sails were stretched out to catch condensation during the night, but all it provided was a small trickle of water, and we're talking about over 100 people. They did what they could to raid turtle nests in the sand. They would trap seabirds with nets from the rigging salvaged from the ships, and they would try to eat the raw flesh of fish they could catch. But almost from the beginning, division had set in, because the French crew held tools, the weapons, and authority, and they didn't see the Malagasy as their equals. They took the best of the food and water, only handing out what remained to the Malagasy. This hunger sharpened into resentment, and the captives had to learn how to survive solely by the sea. They became quite good at fishing, however, it wasn't really enough to sustain people as time went on. Duvernay, now fully in command, knew this island could never sustain this amount of people. He ordered a small boat to be built from the remains of the Utile. Days and weeks went into the effort, with men sawing and lashing beams together under the blistering sun. Despite the suspicions that the Malagasy had, they did help Duvernay build this boat, under the guise that he would rescue them all. When it was finally finished, a choice was made. Duvernay gathered his crew and boarded the fragile craft and prepared to set out. All of the Malagasy were to be left behind, but he offered them words of reassurance that rescue would come and that ships would return. But his promises rang hollow for them. But unfortunately for the Malagasy, they were people that were mostly farmers and herders, coming from small villages who had absolutely zero experience in the sea. So really, the only choice at this point was to trust the French guy at his word that he would actually come back. The Malagasy watched as the crew slowly disappeared over the horizon. For them, the truth began to settle in. They knew they were once captives, but now they had simply become abandoned. Left on a barren island with no food, no water, and certainly no idea whether anyone would ever come back for them. Still can't imagine what a feat that would have been to build a boat that's big enough to carry over 100 people to escape this island. I guess it just goes to show you how desperate the situation was. For the French crew that decided to follow Duvernay in getting off that island, well, their gamble paid off because their raft slowly staggered across the ocean and somehow it actually ends up making landfall in Madagascar. Here, they slipped back into the routines of their daily life, though they filed reports about the missing Malagasy. Duvernay did file reports with the local governors. They spoke about the situation of the captives that remained on this island, and the people there in power made assurances that they would follow up with help. But unfortunately, these promises were only made on paper, and no rescue was brought to fruition, at least at this time. There was nothing more than a series of empty promises. Back on Tromelin Island, the Malagasy realized that they had been betrayed in a way that would sit with them forever. Because here they were marooned on this barren strip of coral, hundreds of kilometers from their homeland, after being stolen, left with no crops and no shelter, other than what they could build with their own hands. And they knew, shortly after they saw Duvernay disappear that first time, that survival, for them, was completely going to be in their hands. On Tromelin, it was the women who stepped up as leaders, keeping the group alive when hope should have ended. They organized what little salvage was left, turning scraps into means of survival. Every nail was pulled from the wreck and hammered flat into crude blades and chisels. Bits of sail and rope were cut into lines and nets. Any planks that were left behind were dragged ashore, but because wood was so precious, they couldn't even be used for shelter. Instead, their shelters were built from the island itself. They were able to stack blocks of coral and stone into low walls, which was just enough to block the wind. These rough cairns gave little comfort, and to anyone who saw them from the shore, they looked more like graves than homes. And eerily enough, these cairns actually resembled graves that were routinely used by the Malagasy people, so for them, it must have been the most ominous thing to be sleeping in these things night after night. On the island, food was a constant battle. Though they were able to get turtle eggs when they could, it wasn't enough to keep them nourished. Any seabirds they were able to catch were roasted when they were able to make small fires from the driftwood, but again, it did not provide enough sustenance to keep these people healthy. Water was really hard. The sails and scrap cloth that they used to gather condensation weren't enough. People were constantly dehydrated. The survivors were able to gather broken stones and clay and dig holes into the ground, shaping crude cisterns to catch rainfall or any groundwater that was available. It didn't work great, but it was enough to keep a few alive. Despite their ability to gather food, water, and make shelter, it just wasn't enough for this amount of people, and the weakest would die first. Unfortunately, that meant the children. Slowly, the elderly would come next. Those too frail to withstand the island's cruelty slipped away one by one. Some ended up being swept out to the sea, while others were laid to rest in shallow graves in the sand. But even in the face of all these tragedies, the women kept everyone together. Despite the insane conditions of survival here, they had to press on, and they started to realize that they might just have to make a life here. They took time to start teaching children how to survive on their own, how to do things like trap and gather water. They started to set up the colony such that they weren't just trying to survive, waiting out to rescue, they were actually making a new life here. They even used some of the metal and things gathered from the boat to forge dishes, to eat off of, and to make tools. But unfortunately, each death would hollow their numbers, and with that, take away a little bit of hope. As they survived season after seasons, unfortunately, those seasons ended up turning to years. And still, year after year, no rescue would come. From the shoreline, the castaways watched sails flicker on the horizon, sometimes near enough to see the shape of a ship, or near enough that they knew the people on board were hearing their cries or seeing their smoke signals. And this betrayal deepened in the years that followed, because French sailors saw them, but they refused to risk their boats to make rescue. Rescue wasn't just delayed by bureaucracy, it seemed to be actively denied. But after each time, the ships would vanish into the distance, leaving them shouting into the wind. Well, hopefully I'm not shouting into the wind here, but if you're enjoying this type of content, consider subscribing to the channel or even sharing it with someone you know. And if it's not for you, just enjoy the vid and maybe we'll catch you next time. Let's move on. Somehow, the survivors refused to give in, even when storms would erase their shelters, when salt winds would chew through their skin, and disease and hunger thinned their numbers until the point where they realized that the entire colony was actually in danger of being wiped out. But somehow, in the midst of this despair, a new life came to be. A child was actually born on Tromelin Island against hunger, thirst, and despair. The child survived in the arms of a woman who refused to let the line of their people die out on this island. The infant became a living symbol of resistance and proof that survival was not only possible here, but that they could build a new life. It was also a driving force for everyone else to survive because now they had to be around to take care of this young child. But at this point, they had been on this island for years. When they first watched the sails go over the horizon, they were counting in days, then months, then things really started to set in when it was years and even at decades. And we're talking at this point now, they had been here 15 years. In the years after the wreck, the French authorities knew that survivors were still on Tromelin. Reports were filed, like I said, and expeditions were planned, but every attempt fell apart. Some captains refused to risk the reefs, saying that the lives of their men were not worth the lives of those in the island, and a few missions were canceled before they even left port because they were written off as too costly. Even though on paper the Malagasy captives were still alive, the French government didn't care that much. But after years of pressure, the French government would eventually start to send ships out to look for survivors. But it would take several years and several attempts of failed rescue expeditions for a ship to actually reach shore. Like I said earlier, it had been 15 years since these people had been abandoned, and Tromelin Island had become a graveyard. It had went down from 60 Malagasy. Originally, only 8 remained, 7 women and 1 single child. Somehow they had outlasted storms, starvation, and betrayal, but their world had shrunk down to this small core unit. Finally, in 1776, one of the French rescue expeditions actually reached shore. It was the French vessel La Dauphine, which anchored cautiously beyond the reef with its crew scanning the Barren Island. On the beach, the last survivors gathered, their clothes ragged, their bodies worn by hunger and years of hardship. They had endured storms, starvation, hunger, dehydration, disease. I mean, this list could just keep going on, seriously. But now, for the first time in 15 years, salvation had actually come. Despite all the false hope of seeing ships over the years, they were actually here, and they had sent longboats through the surf to come ashore. And one by one, the survivors were taken back to the vessel and away from the island that had become their prison. The remaining survivors were brought aboard La Dauphine, and immediately they set sail for the Ile de France, known today as Mauritius. As I mentioned earlier in the show, enslavement had been made illegal at this time, so the women were granted their freedom and became well received by the local authorities. But unfortunately, their names slipped quietly out of history as they were sent back to Madagascar. One person remained, which was the baby. He ended up being baptized as Jacques-Marie and was raised by a governor in their household. The one life that history chose to preserve, well, the rest seemed to be reduced to silence. I really wonder what happened here if this baby was kept back willingly and those women just let him go and went back to Madagascar, or they were separated as part of like a white savior thing that would happen back then. You saw it with native children sometimes as well, where rich white people would take the children away from their own families because, they were going to get a better life in their opinion. Kind of BS in my books, but what do I know? But back in France, despite the atrocities of these people being left behind, no reckoning would come. The captain who was responsible for the ship, de Lafargue, had passed away, meaning that there was no one to really hold accountable. His first officer, Barthélemy Castellan Duvernay, who built the raft and sailed away, was kind of seen as a hero, and he was someone who never faced trial or punishment. But he did file reports and he did pressure the government saying that, hey, there was captives left on this island and maybe you should do something. but it seemed the bureaucracy of France that time just didn't care enough to actually do something about it. So really, who is guilty in all of this? I'm not sure if it's, well, for sure, the captain that died, but I don't know if this is a case really of Varney not putting enough pressure on the government, or the government just not caring that these people were Malagasy and didn't really need to be rescued because they were seen as less important. But either way, it wasn't cool, and it's not right. Certainly didn't take into consideration the mantra, leave no man behind. There was a little bit of a scandal that rose out of this. It was immediately downplayed by the French, and slowly the story became just a small footnote in their history. Eventually, the Isle of Sand was named Tromelin, as I mentioned earlier, after the officer who brought the French ship La Dauphine to rescue the Malagasy. The tragedy of the 152 Malagasy that died and the 18 French sailor is commemorated on the island with a plaque, but the island itself sits as empty as it was in 1761. No trees, no food, and no fresh water. Truly is an awful story. I can't believe what those people went through. I just want to say also thank you for joining in today, and I hope to be back again next week. Thank you, and see you then.